Good evening. Welcome to the sixth screening in the Milestones series hosted by Sabzian, which is also the second in a program of online screenings organized in collaboration with Courtisane. Each of these screenings is accompanied by a hand-picked selection of writings associated with the film in question. And these writings, I think, are particularly important regarding the film that we are presenting tonight, which is Farrebique by Georges Rouquier. This is a film which, when it was released in 1946, stirred up quite a vigorous debate, in particular related to the notion of realism. And in doing so, it brought into sharp focus the limitations, but also the paradoxes of some of the denominators that have been used ad nauseum, I would say, to divide and evaluate the cinematic landscape, such as documentary and fiction, authenticity and duplicity, aestheticism and artfulness. These considerations, however, could not have been further away from Rouquier's mind when he set out to film the life on Farrebique, which is a farmstead at the southern border of the French Massif Central that had been owned by his relatives for generations. This was the farm where his father was born and where he stayed for several months after his father died in Verdun. The childhood memories of this particular time there would serve as a source of inspiration when his producer proposed to him to make a feature film involving the four seasons. This proposal was no little feat for Rouquier, who had received no formal education in filmmaking or any other craft for that matter, and whose vocation for filmmaking was solely based on an avid cinephilia, like the Nouvelle Vague filmmakers after him. Up until that point, Rouquier had only directed two modest documentary shorts, but which already demonstrated his sensibility towards rural craftsmanship. Based on these experiences, Rouquier started working on a screenplay in September 1943, imagining thousands of shots and carefully reconstructing the life on the farm as he knew it, while at the same time crafting this cinematic world around slightly invented storylines. As he himself once stated, in cinema one doesn't capture truth, one recreates it. And then from November 1944 on, he spent a year filming the family, playing and acting their own life, which is governed by the season, by the dinner time ritual of the grandfather cutting and handing out slices of bread, by the toilsome management of farm life on the eve of the introduction of electricity. The first shots we get to see linger on the cracks slithering up the wall of the farmstead. The house needs to be repaired, says the grandfather, and this sets in motion the basic plot of the film, a series of daily comings, goings and disputes, from the installation of electricity to the birth of a child, from quarrels about the farm's inheritance to the cruel anticipation of death. All this Rouquier filmed and edited with a poetic sensibility and a sense of composition and rhythm that summons echoes with the work of Chaplin and Flaherty, Eisenstein and Dovzhenko, all of whom he admired greatly. And the result, I think, is a poetics born from an exquisite attentiveness for the everyday, for its matter, texture, grain and glimmer, but also for the sounds, tonalities, the dialogues and intonations which he recorded directly, rather than choosing for a post-synchronization process, which would have been the common thing to do at the time. So it's no wonder that Piero Costa, when he presented the film at the Courtisane Festival in 2015, described the film as a kind of science fiction, as if the most day-to-day events crystallize and glisten on the screen like we've never seen them before, as if the actions and gestures that are all too often set aside as meritless, as meaningless, prove to be against all odds, all too worthy of fiction. And this particular confounding of documentary and fiction, of truth captured or invented, lived or acted, would provide for the main battleground of the debates that occurred at the time of its release in 1946. But there was also a particular spark that lit the fire, as it were, which was the refusal of the first Cannes Film Festival to include Farrebique in its competition program, which unleashed a storm of protests, a new battle of Hernani, as Jean Pellevé phrased it. On one side of the battlefield, there were the detractors of the film, like Henri Janson, who scornfully remarked that copads are not photogenic, or Jean Fayard, who wrote that Farrebique is not even a documentary, rather a film which teaches us exactly nothing. On the other hand, the film had its avid defenders like Jacques Becker, who hailed it as nothing less than a revolutionary film, or Jacques Prévert, who hailed it as a masterpiece. And then there was André Bazin, who famously and vigorously stood up for the film by declaring that the film's singular accomplishment was to deprive reality of all that has nothing to do with it, especially the parasitism of art. So for Bazin, Farrebique was one of the main examples of a cinema that had finally discovered its true essence, to reveal reality as nothing but itself, in all its mystery, cruelty, and ambiguity. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, another film critic, James Agee, seemed to echo Bazin's defense when he lauded Farrebique as one of the rare films that was able to keep the original promise of cinema alive. The promise, as he wrote, to capture the cruel radiance of what is. After all, he claimed, the camera was the central instrument of his time, able to do nothing else, able to do what nothing else in the world could do. And I quote, to record unaltered reality, and it can be made to perceive, record and communicate in full unaltered power the peculiar kinds of poetic vitality which blaze in every real thing, and which are in great degree, inevitably and properly, lost to every other kind of artist except the camera artist. And surely the calls for this newfound realism by the likes of Bazin and Agee are very much related to their time, when the perceived failure of the radical promises that were ascribed to cinema in its infancy led to a distrust towards the manipulations of fabricated and consumer-friendly plots, which was then opposed with an appeal towards the true vocation of cinematographic art, the potential to reveal the truth of the world by patiently focusing on its unmanipulated surfaces. And this logic hasn't stopped haunting the thinking of cinema, not in the least, as we know, in the two monuments that Gilles Deleuze and Jean-Luc Godard have devoted to its history. Godard even going so far as to suggest that the art of cinema has proclaimed its own demise by its very impossibility of innocence. But cinema continues, and even though there will always be some who like to claim otherwise. And perhaps it's not necessary to see Farrebique as some paragon of ontological realism or a painful reminder of all that has come to pass. And neither are we obliged to see in its depictions of rural life some kind of manifestation of a traditionalist back to the land ideology, as some critics have suggested. I think we can just as well consider Farrebique as part of a lineage that continues up until today, one that continues to explore its force to blur the borders between the real and fiction, one that continues to offer shifting transpositions of the age-old conflict between cinema as arrangement of appearances and cinema as witness of presence. Georges Rouquier, he wasn't all that impressed by the hustle and bustle surrounding his film. After making Farrebique, he directed a series of short films, documentaries, and one feature before finding a sideline as an actor. But in 1983, he went back to the region in order to make a sequel of some kind, Big Phare, with some of the original characters from the first film that he shot 40 years before. And finally, 70 years after its first appearance, Farrebique was given a new lease of life, thanks to a beautiful restoration that you're going to see by Les Documents Cinématographiques. At a moment when contemporary cinema is increasingly, I would say, challenging its borders and divisions, and is eagerly exploring both its documenting and poetic forces to give visibility to unsung lives and histories, Farrebique's splendor might be shining brighter than ever, perhaps, as its achievement, to use James Agee's words, remains wholly of our time. Enjoy the screening.